third briefing, which is for Professor Cook's group on Wildlife Conservation Anti-Trafficking Act of 2019. And I hope that that'll be Tim Woodruff will be doing that briefing. If I got that right, Tim, why don't you begin?
It is Tim. Thank you. All right. Hello, and welcome to my group's final briefing on HR 864, the Wildlife Conservation and Anti-Trafficking Act of 2019. My name is Tim Woodruff, and I would like to thank my managers, Ariella Levy and Allison Day, as well as my team, and especially our advisor, Dr. Cook. Before we go over the legislation, it's important to know that wildlife trafficking is the illegal gathering, transportation, and distribution of animals and their products, such as horns, skins, and bones. It includes local and regional poaching operations, as well as distribution networks. This chart shows the evolution of wildlife trading from a local subsistence-based activity that became less sustainable with population growth, heightened human mobility, and more uses for wildlife. Today, there is an unsustainable and illegal wildlife trafficking sector which causes biodiversity loss and contributes to the spread of zoonotic or animal-based diseases. First, we will go over a case study of one of the world's most trafficked animals, the pangolin. Pangolins are native to Central Africa, India, and Southeast Asia, which are shaded in gray on this map. They are trafficked for their scales, which have perceived medicinal value in traditional medicinal practices, and after they are killed, traffickers remove their scales, and the pangolin's meat and blood are often sold as delicacies. However, there is a serious risk of coming into contact with body fluids, which may carry disease-causing microorganisms. As seen in this image, I'm scaling a pangolin with no protective equipment. This is referred to as direct animal-human contact and is a primary risk for zoonotic disease transmission. Studies have shown a potential connection between COVID-19 and pangolin trafficking, suggesting that pangolins may have played an intermediary role by carrying a mutated and infectious form of the virus between the original source and humans. In addition to the risks of zoonotic disease, removing pangolins from their habitat has serious repercussions for biodiversity. Biodiversity is defined as the variety of all forms of life, from genes to species, and the ecological and evolutionary processes that sustain those life forms. For example, pangolins eat up to 70 million insects per year, mostly termites, ants, and cockroaches, which regulates local pest populations and maintains soil health and crop quality for rural farmers. This is referred to as an ecosystem service, or a human benefit that comes from an organism performing its role in nature. If pangolins are removed, this contributes to biodiversity loss and reduces ecosystem services. HR 864 offers several solutions to the biodiversity loss and zoonotic disease risks posed by illegal wildlife trafficking through 6 policy interventions illustrated in light blue on this flowchart. First, we are going to discuss the 3 policy interventions for biodiversity loss, namely amending existing conservation laws, funding for conservation work, and an international wildlife conservation program. HR 864 amends and expands some pre-existing legislation to protect more species. Under the bill, Fish and Wildlife Service officers can assist with conservation of species like rhinos, tigers, and African elephants. This bill also expands previous conservation legislation to include newly endangered species, such as supporting the conservation of freshwater turtles and tortoises under the Marine Turtle Conservation Act. This expanded legislation also helps combat biodiversity loss by directing the fines on wildlife traffickers to conservation and will therefore come at no added expense to taxpayers. Expanding resources for conservation will also slow biodiversity loss. This will take place on land, but also at sea to help slow illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing through amendments to the Magnuson-Stevens Conservation Act. And slide. The last proposed solution for biodiversity loss is in the development of an international wildlife conservation program. The bill's language allows the Fish and Wildlife Service to administer assistance under existing conservation legislation. The Fish and Wildlife Service officers would focus on international conservation programs to protect the species listed on the right. And the slide. Okay. One example of effective conservation legislation comes from the American alligator in Florida. American alligators were listed as endangered in 1967 by the Endangered Species Preservation Act due to unregulated hunting to make leather from their skins. In the 1950s, the American alligator population was estimated at 100,000 individuals spread across the southern states. But after 12 years of protection, between 500,000 and 1 million alligators survived in Florida alone. Once American alligators were protected under the Endangered Species Preservation Act, their populations recovered to the point where they could be hunted sustainably again, supporting local economies through ecotourism. Next, we will go over the zoonotic disease components of the bill, namely the placement of Fish and Wildlife Service officers abroad, awarding whistleblowers, and increasing penalties for trafficking. The bill calls for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service officers to be stationed abroad to assist in conservation and enforcement in countries of concern. This map shows where officers are currently stationed in countries in blue, and under the bill, officers would be stationed in hotspots shown in red on the map. If these international agents are able to stem wildlife trafficking, then there are fewer opportunities for zoonotic diseases to make the jump from trafficked animals to human populations. Another important policy intervention in this bill is encouraging whistleblowing, which is the practice of criminal insiders disclosing illegal activity to law enforcement organizations. This practice provides wildlife regulators with important information about criminal organizations and helps improve enforcement. However, whistleblowers require a high reward that matches the personal risk of speaking out against dangerous organizations. This is why this bill increases whistleblower rewards to encourage more individuals to come forward with information. Additionally, organized crime is also involved with the trafficking of pangolin scales, which are pictured in this image. Given that, one more solution is to make wildlife trafficking violations much more serious crimes. This bill will amend the Travel Act and the racketeering statute, which will increase fines on wildlife traffickers and increase the ease of prosecutions and the severity of the penalties. However, there are several controversies with the solutions offered in this bill that we have broken up into three categories: scientific, social, and geopolitical. First, I will discuss the scientific controversies. While conservation is generally effective, there are instances when conservation is an ineffective method for biodiversity protection. This is the result when regulations are poorly enforced or when conservation undermines local communities which rely on their natural surroundings for food and income. For example, conservation legislation may ban certain fishing practices to reduce bycatch of other species, but this ban may jeopardize local fishers' incomes. In addition to ecosystem health, conservation must support local incomes and food security while also using strong enforcement to undermine trafficking. The social controversies surrounding the bill are related to the cultural uses of wildlife products. In some cases, such as with the rhino horn trade, the wildlife product is used in traditional medicinal practices. International conservation organizations claim there is no proven benefit medicinally, but these products are so culturally ingrained. The way forward requires education, enhanced scientific investigation, and engagement with the communities that use these products. Last are the geopolitical controversies surrounding the bill. The United States can make very strict laws regarding wildlife trafficking, but in the end, these laws may only be enacted and applied to an extent. The bill may be seen as cultural imperialism as the US enforces conservation values globally without regard for longstanding culture and tradition. Now we move to the question of how to measure this bill's success. Due to the inherent challenge of measuring illegal activity, indirect measurements are the primary metrics to evaluate any success. One indicator of successful conservation would be to determine biodiversity markers and population trends before conservation measures in the bill are enacted, and then again afterwards. This provides a baseline to compare against, and then the conservation intervention's effectiveness can be determined. Another way to measure success related to fines and penalties would be measuring total conservation funding after the bill's implementation and comparing it to previous funding awards. In terms of measuring zoonotic diseases, there are several options. One is to perform disease testing in wildlife markets or on animals intercepted by customs officials, and another option is to maintain a count of wildlife market closures. While it is difficult to measure the avoidance of a problem, these measures indicate falling risk levels, which is just as important. Finally, there are some common ways to directly measure the movement of trafficked products, including the number, volume, or weight of seized animals. It's also pretty straightforward to track how many arrests occur as a result of whistleblowing to determine if enforcement is improved as a result of enhanced rewards. In closing, H.R. 864 is a bill that attempts to fill policy gaps to stop wildlife trafficking. By encouraging conservation and leveraging the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, among other policy interventions, the bill aims to reduce biodiversity loss, slow the global movement of wildlife, and stem the spread of zoonotic disease. Thank you. I am happy to take any questions.
Okay, very nice work. Good job, Tim. Any questions from our class or guests?
Great, you guys can either type them in the chat box or raise your hands. Oh, it looks like we got one. So Abigail was wondering, what metric does the bill use to measure biodiversity?
So biodiversity is a complex measurement. The bill doesn't go into how to measure that, but some ways that we indicated are taking surveys of species richness. So that's counting plants, animals, and insect life in an area. There are many technical methods in the field, and it gets more complicated when you consider oceanic biodiversity, but generally it includes counting the number of species and how many individuals are present, and then measuring those trends over time to determine whether biodiversity is holding steady, rising, or falling.
Okay, very good. Other questions? Yes,
Okay, we have a hand raised from Rachel.
Okay.
Hi, Tim. Great presentation. I also had a question about measuring success because I think one of the metrics was arrests, how many arrests and finding trafficking instances there were. And I'm wondering how you reconcile the real success of the bill, which would be driving down the amount of trafficking, with measuring successful enforcement of or finding instances of trafficking when it does occur.
Okay, that's a great question. Generally speaking, this bill has a very strong enforcement component related to the organized crime aspect of wildlife trafficking, which is very broad. And so reducing trafficking involves dismantling those criminal rings. And so high arrests and prosecutions indicates that the whistleblower system is working and that organized crime is being dismantled, which means that there are fewer resources and people behind trafficking. And again, as we said, it's a very complicated thing to measure because it's crime, it's clandestine. And so you have to look at it from these indirect outside measurements. And so arrests is just one of those that measures enforcement on the social side, not so much on the scientific side.
Okay, very good. We have one final question for our briefer.
All right, Jenny has another question. Let's see.
Okay, Jenny?
I wanted to know, Tim, would you make any amendments, or your team make any amendments to the bill that would factor in what you mentioned of the cultural insensitivity, or also like is there a measurement that could be inserted into the bill to and analyze like social impacts and make sure that there's proper like community engagement?
That's not something we really discussed. I will say though that the Fish and Wildlife Service officers that are placed abroad have a lot of leeway in their work. So they are supposed to work with NGOs and with government organizations abroad and with communities. And so a lot of it really depends on how the director of the agency and how the people overseeing outreach and conservation develop these programs. So a lot of it is on the implementation side, not so much on the legislative side. So I think it's really important that the director takes that into consideration, but it's not something that we've talked about as an amendment to the bill.
Okay, All right, thank you very much, Tim. Thank you for a great presentation. Let's give him a virtual hand, everybody. And I think what we'll do now, it is now 10:45. We're going to take a 5-minute break, and at 10:50 we will resume with Griffin's briefing. Okay? So everybody, let's take 5.